The job listing said, live-in personal assistant, immediate start, competitive salary. It did not say, previous applicants have fled in the middle of the night. It did not say, your predecessor left without collecting her final paycheck. And it absolutely did not say, the man you will be working for has not smiled at another human being in 4 years. Hannah Chen found all of this out on her first morning, standing in the marble entrance hall of a mansion so large it had its own echo, holding a folder of her credentials that suddenly felt very, very thin. 23 assistants, the head butler, a silver-haired man named Mr. Ellis, murmured beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. In 3 years. Some lasted weeks. The last one lasted 11 days. Hannah adjusted the strap of her bag. What happened to them? Mr. Ellis glanced sideways at her. Some quit. Some were dismissed. One simply, he paused, choosing his word carefully, disappeared from the schedule. Hannah nodded slowly. She was 28, broadly built, with round cheeks that made strangers assume she was harmless, and sharp eyes that made people regret that assumption. She had spent 6 years reading people for a living, first as a behavioral consultant for a hospitality chain, then as a crisis mediator for a private firm. She could identify a lie from across a dinner table. She could sense grief in a room before anyone had spoken a word. She had walked into difficult environments before, but the moment the double doors at the end of the hall opened, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt uncertain. Damien Rousseau walked toward her without hurrying. He was tall, dark-suited, with the kind of composed face that gave absolutely nothing away. No tension in his jaw, no curiosity in his eyes, no irritation at being interrupted. Most people, when meeting someone new, give themselves away within the first 3 seconds. A flicker of judgment, a trace of nerves, even the faintest smile of politeness. Damien gave her nothing. He stopped 2 feet away, looked at her once, not up and down, not dismissively, just a single, complete look, and then spoke. You mediated a labor dispute at the Harrington Group 2 years ago. 47 employees, 3 senior managers, a lawsuit that had been building for 8 months. He said it the way someone reads weather data, factual, flat. You resolved it in 6 days. Hannah kept her expression steady. I did. How? I listened to the people everyone else had stopped listening to. Something shifted in his face. Not an expression exactly, more like the absence of one expression being replaced by the absence of a different one. He turned slightly and gestured for her to follow. They walked through a corridor lined with family portraits, serious faces, formal poses, everyone looking like they had been told to perform dignity rather than feel it. Damien stopped in front of a set of closed library doors. I ask every candidate one question before they begin, he said, his back still half turned. Not about scheduling, not about confidentiality. Previous assistants prepared answers about task management and conflict resolution. He finally turned to face her. The question has nothing to do with either of those things. Hannah waited. What does a person lose first, Damien said, when they stop trusting others? The hallway went quiet. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked. Hannah had worked with executives who asked trick questions to see if you'd panic. She had sat across from men who used silence as a weapon. She recognized the shape of a test. But she didn't think about it strategically. She didn't calculate an answer. Something about the way he asked it, not sharply, not cleverly, but with the quiet weight of someone who genuinely needed to know, made her answer from somewhere instinctive. Their peace, she said. Damien didn't react. His expression didn't change. He didn't nod or tilt his head or draw a slow breath the way people do when something lands. He simply looked at her for one long moment, then turned and walked back down the corridor. Hannah stood there, genuinely unsure if she'd passed or failed. Mr. Ellis appeared at her shoulder 30 seconds later, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked slightly stunned. "He said to show you to your room," the butler said quietly, "and to have your schedule ready by morning." Hannah blinked. "That's it?" "Miss Chen," Mr. Ellis lowered his voice. "In 3 years, I have never heard him walk away without saying, 'dismissed.'" He glanced down the now empty corridor. "You are the first person he has kept." Hannah looked toward where Damien had gone. The corridor was empty, the portrait staring blankly down at her, the clock still ticking somewhere out of sight. She had read hundreds of people in her career. She could sense what a person carried before they told her. She could feel the difference between someone who was cold and someone who was carefully contained. Damien Russo was neither cold nor contained. He was something she had no word for yet. And that, more than the mansion or the rumors or the 23 assistants before her, was the thing that made Hannah Chen decide she wasn't going anywhere. She wanted to understand him. She just had no idea yet what that understanding was going to cost her. The mansion had a language of its own. Hannah discovered this within her first 48 hours. Not the language of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, that was just money talking, but the quieter language of the people who lived and worked inside it, the small tensions, the careful silences, the way certain staff members avoided certain hallways at certain hours. By her second morning, she already knew that Marco, the head cook, was worried about his mother's health, but hadn't told anyone because he didn't want to appear distracted. She knew because he oversalted the breakfast eggs, something a man with 15 years of professional cooking only does when his mind is somewhere else entirely. She said nothing about his mother. She simply asked him, while passing through the kitchen, whether he needed any flexible hours that week. Marco stared at her like she'd read his mail. "My mother has an appointment Thursday," he said carefully. "I wasn't going to ask." "Thursday's covered," Hannah said, already walking out. "I'll arrange it with Mr. Ellis." By day 3, the gardener, a quiet older man named Sue, had started leaving a small cup of tea outside her office door each morning without being asked. She had noticed him favoring his left wrist and suggested, casually, during a walk through the grounds, that the east garden beds might be easier to manage from the right side. He hadn't said thank you. He didn't need to. By day 4, 2 of the younger bodyguards had stopped their Cold War over a misunderstanding involving a missing wristwatch, which Hannah had quietly figured out was sitting in the wrong jacket pocket in the staff cloakroom. She mentioned it to neither of them directly. She simply left a note on the cloakroom shelf that said, "Check the inside pocket of the black jacket." The Cold War ended by dinner. Mr. Ellis watched all of this with the expression of a man witnessing something he couldn't quite classify. On the evening of day 5, he found Hannah in the small sitting room off the east corridor, updating Damien's weekly schedule with color-coded tabs. "The staff speak well of you," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movement of someone whose knees had been complaining for years. "They're good people," Hannah said without looking up. "They just needed someone to notice them." Mr. Ellis was quiet for a moment. "You have a gift." "It's not a gift, it's attention." She capped her pen. "Most people tell you everything without meaning to. You just have to be willing to look." The old butler nodded slowly. Then, almost to himself, he said, "He wasn't always the way he is now." Hannah looked up. Mr. Ellis seemed to realize he'd spoken aloud. He straightened slightly, the professional composure sliding back into place. "I only mean, the household has been this way for some time. It is good to see it breathe again." He left before she could ask a single follow-up question. Hannah sat with that for a long while. He wasn't always the way he is now. She had spent 5 days trying to read Damien Russo and had come away with almost nothing. She had observed him in 3 meetings, 2 phone calls, 1 property walkthrough, and at least a dozen corridor crossings. She had watched him make decisions that would unsettle most people without a single change in his breathing. She had seen staff members flinch at shadows he didn't even cast. He wasn't cruel. That was the thing that kept surprising her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't belittle. He simply existed at a temperature that made everyone around him feel slightly underdressed for the weather. But there were small things. The way he paused, barely a second but a pause nonetheless, outside the door of a room on the 3rd floor that no one seemed to enter. The way he moved a small framed photograph on his desk 2 inches to the left every morning, seemingly without realizing he was doing it. The way he asked her, at the end of day 4, whether the East Garden was being properly maintained, not as a complaint, but with something underneath the question, something almost careful. Hannah filed every detail away without showing she'd noticed. And then there was Victor. Damien's younger cousin had arrived on day 3 with expensive luggage, a louder voice than the house seemed built for, and the particular energy of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in a room and was currently unhappy about the mathematics. He wasn't hostile to Hannah. That would have been too obvious. He was pleasant in the exaggerated way of someone performing pleasantness, complimenting her organizational system in a tone that suggested he found it amusing, asking about her background with the smile of someone collecting information rather than making conversation. On day 5, she caught him watching her from the upper landing while she spoke with Mr. Ellis below. He didn't look away when she noticed. He simply smiled, raised his glass slightly, a small, unhurried toast, and walked away. Hannah looked back down at her schedule. She had dealt with difficult executives, grieving families, and rooms full of people who all believed they were right. She was not worried about Victor. She was, however, paying attention. The invitation said, "Black tie, 7 o'clock, the Harlow Grand Ballroom." Hannah wore navy, not because she was making a statement, but because she owned one formal dress, and it happened to be navy. She stood beside Damien's car as the driver held the door, watching the stream of guests ascending the hotel steps in silks and diamonds, and made a quiet mental note of everything she could observe before she even walked inside. The woman near the entrance touching her necklace every 30 seconds, nervous about someone inside. The man greeting guests at the top of the steps, whose smile activated only his mouth, performing warmth he wasn't feeling. The younger couple who arrived together but hadn't looked at each other once since stepping out of their car. A room full of stories, and the evening hadn't even started. Damien appeared beside her without a word, adjusted one shirt cuff, and walked toward the entrance. Hannah followed, schedule in hand, already mapping the evening. Inside, the ballroom was exactly the kind of room designed to make people feel significant. Enormous chandeliers, round tables draped in white, a string quartet producing elegant background noise that no one was actually listening to. Hannah moved efficiently through her role, confirming Damien's seating arrangement, intercepting a scheduling conflict between 2 donors who had apparently not been told they disliked each other, and quietly redirecting a journalist who had no business being near the private reception area. Damien moved through it all like weather. People approached him carefully. Conversations with him were short, precise, and left the other person looking slightly like they had just handed over something they hadn't planned to. Hannah watched from a respectful distance, close enough to assist, far enough to observe. And she noticed things. She noticed the heavy-set businessman near the bar, who kept angling himself toward Damien while pretending to face the other direction, gathering information without committing to a conversation. She noticed the charity director, whose speech was polished, but whose hands gripped the podium with the tension of someone hiding a financial problem. She noticed a table of old associates near the windows, who smiled at Damien across the room with the specific warmth of people who were afraid of him. At one point, Damien leaned slightly toward her and said, low and even, "The man in the grey suit near the pillar. He's been watching the exit for the last 20 minutes, Hannah said without looking up from her tablet. Not anxious, calculating. He's deciding whether to leave before someone arrives. A pause. Who taught you to do that? Nobody, she said. I just watch. He said nothing further, but he moved the grey-suited man from his after-dinner meeting list without explanation, and Hannah felt something small but significant. The quiet satisfaction of being useful in a way that actually mattered. It was near the end of the main dinner hour when it happened. Hannah was scanning the room for the event coordinator when her eyes passed over Damien. He was standing slightly apart from a cluster of guests, holding his glass without drinking from it. His default position at social events, she'd learned, when his gaze moved to the far side of the ballroom. And he smiled. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A real smile. Not the polite performance she'd seen him produce for handshakes, but something that reached the corners of his eyes and changed the entire architecture of his face. He looked, in that brief moment, like someone completely different. Younger, unguarded, almost painfully human. Then it was gone. Hannah followed his eyeline immediately. An elderly woman sat alone at a small table near the side exit, simply dressed in a way that stood out in the ballroom like a garden chair at a formal dinner. She had white hair pinned neatly back, hands folded on the table, and the composed stillness of someone who had learned to be comfortable taking up very little space. She wasn't looking at Damien. She was looking at something Hannah couldn't see, perhaps nothing at all, just looking the way very old people sometimes do, turned inward toward something only they can access. Hannah looked back at Damien. His face was its usual closed door again. She excused herself from the conversation she'd been half-managing and moved across the room toward the elderly woman's table. She wasn't entirely sure why. Instinct, mostly. The same instinct that had made her answer their piece in a corridor 8 days ago. But by the time she reached the table, it was empty. The chair was neatly pushed in. The small water glass was untouched. Whoever the woman was, she had left without sound, without announcement, and without anyone seeming to notice her go. Hannah looked at the side exit door, then back across the ballroom at Damien. He was already in conversation with someone else, composed and unreadable as ever. If he had noticed the woman leave, he gave no sign. Hannah stood at the empty table for a moment, looking at the untouched glass. A man who hadn't smiled in years had smiled tonight. For less than 2 seconds, at a woman no one else seemed to know. And now the woman was gone. Hannah pulled out her small notebook and wrote one line. Who is she? It was a music box, handcrafted rosewood, no larger than a hardcover book, with a small brass ballerina on the lid that rotated when the mechanism was wound. It had belonged to Damien's late mother. It sat on the 3rd shelf of the family study, between a framed photograph and a small ceramic vase, and according to Mr. Ellis, it had not been moved in 4 years. Hannah knew this because she had noticed it on her 3rd day while organizing the study's filing system. She had moved carefully around it, the way you move around something that belongs to someone's grief, with deliberate, respectful distance. Which was why, on the morning it disappeared, she felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. It started with Victor. Not loudly, not accusingly. That wasn't his style. He simply mentioned, over breakfast, in the presence of 3 staff members and one of Damien's associates, that the study had been reorganized recently. He said it pleasantly, with the particular tone of someone placing a stone in a path they want others to trip on. Things get moved when spaces are reorganized, he added, reaching for his coffee. Understandable, of course. New people don't always know the value of what they're touching. Nobody looked at Hannah directly. That was almost worse. By mid-morning, the music box had officially been reported missing. By noon, the mansion had the specific tension of a house that has decided something without saying it out loud. Staff members who had been warm toward Hannah for over a week now answered her questions with one word. The bodyguards who had quietly settled their dispute with her help now stood straighter when she passed, like they were trying not to be associated with her. Hannah sat in her office and thought carefully. She had not taken the music box. That was a fact, and facts were where she always started. She had reorganized the study 9 days ago, catalogued everything on each shelf using a handwritten inventory, and left the music box exactly where she had found it. She had the inventory sheet. She had the date. She had, without knowing she would need it, documented everything. But she also understood that evidence doesn't always matter as much as narrative, and the narrative currently being written, quietly, pleasantly, by a man who smiled too easily, was that the new assistant had disturbed something she shouldn't have. The hardest part was not the suspicion. The hardest part was Damien. He called her into his office at 2 in the afternoon. She sat across from him at his desk, the same desk with the photograph he moved 2 inches every morning, and waited. He didn't accuse her. His voice remained the same temperature it always was. He asked her to walk him through her reorganization of the study. She did, clearly and completely, referencing the inventory sheet she'd brought without being asked. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the sheet for a moment, then set it down, and said nothing. Not, "I believe you," not, "This doesn't add up," not even, "I'll look into it." Just silence, and then a slight nod toward the door. Hannah stood, picked up her folder, and left. She made it to the east corridor before she stopped walking. She stood very still for a moment, facing the window at the end of the hall, watching the garden outside where Sue was quietly pruning the hedges in the afternoon light. She was hurt. She acknowledged that privately, the way she acknowledged most things, honestly, without drama, and then set it aside. Because here was what she knew from years of reading rooms full of complicated people. The person creating chaos rarely looks chaotic. They look reasonable. They look uninvolved. They ask gentle questions and make mild observations, and let other people draw the conclusions they've been quietly arranging. Victor hadn't accused her. He had simply created the conditions for everyone else to. Hannah went back to her room, opened her notebook, and began writing down every incident since Victor's arrival. Not just the music box, the small things. The morning he'd asked which rooms she had access to. The afternoon he'd casually inquired about Damien's schedule in a way that wasn't quite casual. The way he'd been near the family study the evening before the music box disappeared. She wrote for 40 minutes. Then she sat back and looked at what she had. Victor wasn't after the music box. That much was becoming clear. A man who wore watches worth more than most people's cars didn't need a rosewood music box. He was after something else, and the music box was simply the most elegant tool available to him. He wanted her gone. The question Hannah couldn't yet answer was why. What was she getting close to, without even knowing it, that made her presence in this house dangerous to him? She looked at her notebook, at the single line she'd written the night of the gala. Who is she? The elderly woman, the smile that lasted 2 seconds, the childhood Damien never spoke about. The question he'd been asking every assistant for 3 years, waiting for an answer that would give him something she still couldn't name. Everything was connected. She just needed to find the thread that tied it together. The guest book was old enough to have water stains on the cover. Hannah had found it 3 days after the music box disappeared, tucked behind a row of accounting ledgers on the lowest shelf of the estate library. The shelf nobody reached because everything useful was higher up. It was a visitor's log from a property Damien's family had owned decades ago. Most entries were unremarkable. Dates, names, brief notes written in the careful handwriting of people who knew someone might read it later. But near the back, one entry was different. The handwriting was looser, warmer, like whoever wrote it wasn't thinking about being read. They were just thinking. The name at the top was Miriam Voss. The location listed beneath it was a village called Aldenmore, 2 hours outside the city. And at the bottom of the entry, instead of the standard farewell note, someone had written a single line that didn't belong in a guest book at all. Some doors stay closed not because they're locked, but because no one was gentle enough to try. Hannah read it twice. Then she photographed it, closed the book, and put it back exactly where she'd found it. That evening, she found Mr. Ellis in the butler's pantry and asked him, as casually as she could manage, whether the name Miriam Voss meant anything to him. The old man went very still, not frightened, not guilty, still in the way of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just felt the weight of it shift. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked quietly. "The guest book in the library." He was silent for a long moment. Then he set down the silver polish he'd been holding and said, "She was the closest thing Damien's mother had to a sister. She lives in Aldenmore still, I believe." He paused. "I haven't heard anyone speak her name in this house in years." Hannah looked at him carefully. "Would you take me there?" Mr. Ellis studied her face for a moment with the expression of someone doing a very careful calculation. Then he nodded once, slowly, like a man making a decision he'd been postponing for too long. "Saturday," he said, "when the house is occupied with other things." Aldenmore was the kind of village that existed quietly, unbothered by the pace of anything beyond its own hedgerows, small stone houses, a market square with a dry fountain in the center, streets narrow enough that 2 cars passing each other required patience and cooperation. Miriam Voss lived at the end of a lane lined with overgrown lavender, in a house that looked like it had been built for exactly one person and had spent decades being exactly enough. She answered the door before Hannah could knock a second time, which suggested either very good hearing or she had been expecting someone. She was in her late 70s, sharp-eyed beneath soft white brows, and she looked at Hannah with the particular focus of someone who had learned to see past surfaces. "You work for Damien," she said, not a question. "I do," Hannah said. "I saw you at the Harlow Gala. I saw him." She paused, choosing her word. "Notice you." Something moved across Miriam's face, not quite a smile. "Come in." The house smelled of dried herbs and old books. They sat at a small kitchen table with tea that Miriam produced without asking whether Hannah wanted any, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Miriam said, "He was not always who he is now. I imagine someone has told you that already." "In fragments," Hannah said. "He was a bright boy." Miriam's voice was steady, but her hands wrapped tighter around her cup. "Expressive. Trusting in the way that only children who have been genuinely loved can be. His mother, Elena, she was the same. That family felt everything loudly." She paused. "Until they learned it cost them." She told Hannah what she knew, that when Damien was 19, Elena had made a decision, a significant one involving the family estate and a transfer of assets, without explaining it to him first. From the outside, it looked like she was moving money away from Damien's portion of the inheritance. It looked, to a 19-year-old who had been raised to equate trust with transparency, like his mother had stopped believing in him. He had never confronted her. Instead, he went quiet in the way that some people go quiet, completely and permanently. Elena died 14 months later, before the misunderstanding was ever addressed. Before she could explain that the asset transfer had been a protection, a legal shield she'd arranged to keep his inheritance safe from men inside their own family who had been circling it for years. She had done it for him. He never knew. Hannah sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere deep. "The question he asks," she said slowly, "what does a person lose first when they stop trusting others?" "He's been asking it since she died," Miriam said quietly. "He doesn't know he's really asking something else entirely." She looked at Hannah with those sharp, careful eyes. He's asking whether his mother lost her peace when she stopped trusting that he would understand. Hannah opened her mouth to respond, and then Miriam pressed one hand to her chest and her face changed. Hannah was on her feet immediately. "Miriam, I'm all right." But her voice had thinned. She reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a small photograph, pressing it into Hannah's hand with surprising firmness.
"Take this. It was Elena's."
Hannah looked down. A photograph, old, slightly faded, of a young woman sitting beside a rosewood music box, laughing at something outside the frame. She looked up. Miriam was already leaning back in her chair, eyes closed, breathing slowly but unevenly. Mr. Ellis appeared in the doorway. "We need to call someone." Hannah closed her hand around the photograph. She had the fragment. Not the whole story, but enough of it to understand that the music box sitting in that family study was not just an heirloom. It was the last thing Elena had touched before everything went wrong. And somewhere inside it, Hannah was certain, was the rest of the truth. The mansion felt different when she returned. Not visibly. The marble was still polished, the flowers in the entrance hall still fresh, the staff still moving through their routines with the precision of a household that had been running on structure for years. But Hannah had spent enough time in complicated rooms to know that atmospheres change before anything visible does, like the air pressure shifting before rain. Something had moved while she was gone. She found out what within the hour. 3 things had happened during her Saturday absence. First, a folder of confidential meeting notes had gone missing from Damien's office, notes that only 3 people had access to, and Hannah was one of them. Second, a business call Damien had scheduled for Saturday afternoon had been quietly cancelled by someone using the household scheduling system, which Hannah managed. Third, one of the younger housemaids had apparently told a senior bodyguard that she'd seen Hannah near Damien's office the previous evening. Hannah had been in the East Library the previous evening, alone, finding the guest book. She sat with these 3 facts in her room and felt the architecture of it clearly. Each incident on its own was explainable. Together they formed something deliberate, a pattern designed to look like carelessness at best and betrayal at worst. Whoever had built it understood exactly how suspicion works. You don't need proof. You just need enough smoke that people start looking for the fire. She thought about going to Damien immediately. She decided against it. Not because she was afraid of his reaction. She had stopped being afraid of his silences somewhere around day 6. But because walking in with accusations and no evidence was exactly what this situation wanted her to do. It would make her look desperate. And a desperate person looks guilty even when they're not. Instead, Hannah did what she always did. She watched. Over the next 4 days, she moved through the mansion with the same calm efficiency she'd maintained since day 1, but now with a second layer of attention running beneath everything. She noted who was where at what time. She tracked which staff members seemed uncomfortable around her and which ones were performing discomfort they didn't actually feel. She paid particular attention to the scheduling system, checking the access log with the quiet thoroughness of someone who already knew what they were going to find. She found it on day 3. The cancelled meeting had been rescheduled from a device that wasn't hers. The access timestamp showed the change had been made at 11:42 on Saturday morning, when Hannah had already been on the road to Aldenmore for nearly 2 hours. She didn't tell anyone. She simply took a photograph of the screen and saved it. The missing folder reappeared on day 4, slipped back into the filing cabinet with the careful placement of someone who had read its contents and wanted it found rather than missing. Hannah noted the page order had changed. Someone had been looking for something specific. And the housemaid, who claimed to have seen Hannah near the office? Hannah had a quiet conversation with her on the afternoon of day 4 that had nothing to do with the incident. They talked about the housemaid's upcoming transfer request, which Hannah had been helping process. By the end of the conversation, the young woman looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with Hannah and everything to do with what she'd been asked to say by someone else. Hannah thanked her and left without pressing further. She had enough. She sat in her office that evening and laid it all out in her notebook. Not emotionally. She had learned years ago that emotion clouds the shape of things, but structurally. Every incident since Victor's arrival mapped in sequence. The music box, the casual observations at breakfast, the cancelled meeting, the missing folder, the housemaid. And then she saw it. The thing she had been circling without landing on. Victor wasn't trying to steal from Damien. He wasn't competing for power or money or position in any straightforward sense. What he was doing was far more specific than that. He was trying to make sure Hannah left before she found something. Not the music box, not the meeting notes. Something older. Something that, based on what Miriam had told her in that small kitchen in Aldenmore, involved the family estate, a legal transfer, and men inside the family who had been circling Elena's assets long before she died. Victor wasn't Damien's jealous younger cousin causing petty trouble. Victor was one of those men, or the son of one. And whatever paperwork or record existed that could confirm what Elena had actually done with those assets and why was somewhere in this house. And Hannah, without knowing it, had been getting close to it. She closed her notebook. For the first time since arriving, she felt something shift inside her own chest. Not fear exactly, something more focused than fear. The specific alertness of someone who has just realized the game they're in is larger than the one they were told about. She looked at the photograph Miriam had pressed into her hand, Elena laughing beside the music box. Then she looked at the inventory sheet from the study reorganization, and she remembered something she had written almost without thinking, 9 days ago, at the bottom of the third shelf list. Music box, rosewood, brass mechanism, heavier than expected. Heavier than expected. She hadn't thought about it at the time. She was thinking about it now. The music box had never left the mansion. Hannah found it on a Tuesday morning, and the finding of it was so quiet, so undramatic, that it felt almost wrong, like a storm that ends not with thunder, but with the sudden absence of wind. She had gone back to the family study with her original inventory sheet, moving slowly through the room the way you move when you're not looking for something specific, but trusting your attention to land where it needs to. She checked every shelf, every drawer, every surface she had catalogued 9 days ago with the careful handwriting of someone who didn't yet know why the details mattered. It was behind the false back panel of the lowest cabinet. Not hidden with any great sophistication, no lock, no mechanism, just a thin panel of wood fitted flush against the back of the cabinet that only revealed itself when you applied pressure at the right corner. Hannah found it because the shelf was 2 inches shallower than the cabinet's exterior suggested, and she had measured shelves obsessively since childhood for reasons she'd never fully examined. The music box sat inside the hidden space, wrapped in a soft cloth, completely undamaged, the brass ballerina on the lid catching the morning light when Hannah unwrapped it. She sat on the floor of the study and looked at it for a long moment. Then she wound the mechanism carefully, the way the photograph had shown Elena doing, left hand steadying the base, right hand turning the key, with the patient attention of someone who understood the thing was delicate. The ballerina began to rotate. The tune that came out was small and precise and achingly familiar, in the way that music sometimes is, even when you've never heard it before. Something about the notes that felt like a memory belonging to someone else. She let it play to the end. Then she turned the box over. The base panel was held in place by 4 small brass screws, old enough to have oxidized slightly at the edges. Hannah found a letter opener in the desk drawer and used it carefully, working each screw loose with the patience of someone who understood that rushing this particular moment would be a kind of disrespect. The panel came free. Inside, folded into a neat square and wrapped in waxed paper that had preserved it against time, was a journal. Small, leather-bound, the initials E.R. embossed on the cover. Elena Russo. Hannah sat very still for a moment with the journal in her hands. Through the study window she could see the east garden, Sue moving quietly between the hedgerows, the morning light doing what morning light does when it has no idea how significant its timing is. She opened the journal. She read for 40 minutes without moving. Elena's handwriting was clear and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who chose words carefully because she understood their weight. The journal wasn't a diary in the ordinary sense. It wasn't a record of days. It was more like a long letter written to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone at once, by a woman who knew she was running out of time to say things properly. The entries covered 4 months. The last one was dated 11 days before Elena died, and piece by piece, page by page, the full shape of it emerged. Elena had known about the men in the family who were positioning themselves around the estate assets, Victor's father primary among them. She had consulted a private legal advisor without telling Damien because she hadn't wanted to frighten him, or worse, cause him to act impulsively in a way that would expose the strategy before it was complete. The asset transfer had been a legal maneuver, complex, carefully constructed, designed to place Damien's inheritance inside a protected structure that couldn't be touched by anyone contesting the estate. She had done it in secret to protect it. She had planned to explain everything once it was finalized. She ran out of time. But the entry that made Hannah stop breathing for a full 3 seconds was not about the assets or the legal structure or Victor's father. It was the second-to-last entry, written in slightly unsteadier handwriting than the others, as though Elena had been tired when she wrote it. Damien has gone quiet in the way I know means he is hurting. He thinks I have stopped trusting him. I can see it in the way he looks at me now. Not angry, just carefully closed, the way he used to close his bedroom door when he was small and didn't want me to see him cry. I want to tell him that trust isn't something I could ever lose for him. It is the one thing I have never once had to think about. But I don't know how to begin the conversation without explaining everything, and I'm not ready to explain everything yet. I keep thinking there will be more time. I keep thinking tomorrow. Hannah read that paragraph 3 times. She sat on the floor of the family study in the morning light, with a dead woman's journal in her hands, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt the full weight of what Damien had been carrying. He hadn't become unreadable because he was cold. He had become unreadable because at 19 years old he had closed the door so his mother wouldn't see him cry, and she had died before he ever opened it again. The question he'd been asking every assistant for 3 years, what does a person lose first when they stop trusting others, wasn't a test. It was a confession. He had been asking because he needed to understand what his mother had felt in those final months, believing her son had quietly turned away from her. And Hannah had answered it the only way that mattered, not cleverly, compassionately. She closed the journal gently and held it for a moment. Then she stood up, straightened her clothes, and went to find Damien. The lakeside estate was 2 hours from the city and looked like somewhere people went to make decisions that couldn't be unmade. Large, stone-fronted, surrounded by water on 2 sides and dense tree line on the 3rd. The kind of property that had hosted generations of difficult conversations under the pretense of family occasions. Today's pretense was a quarterly gathering, relatives, associates, a handful of people who existed in the gray space between both categories. Tables had been arranged on the terrace overlooking the lake, and the afternoon light was doing its best to make everything look civilized. Hannah had not told Damien about the journal yet. She had tried, the morning she found it. She had gone to his office, journal in hand, and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. He had looked up, registered her presence, and then something in his expression, that familiar closed-door quality, but with something underneath it she hadn't seen before, something almost braced, like a man waiting for bad news, had made her pause. She had decided the journal deserved more than a hallway moment. She had decided it deserved the right time. She hadn't anticipated that Victor would choose his moment first. It happened an hour into the gathering, when the afternoon had softened enough that people had stopped performing alertness and settled into the comfortable looseness of second drinks and old conversations. Victor stood near the head table with the easy confidence of someone who had been planning this for longer than today, and he began to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He used the tone of a man raising a concern, measured, reluctant, almost apologetic, which was the most dangerous tone available to someone with bad intentions. "I think we should discuss," he said, addressing the table at large while looking at no one in particular, "the question of who currently has access to the family's private records, given the recent incidents at the mansion." He paused. "Given what's been going missing." The table went quiet in the way of people who have been waiting for something and are relieved it has finally arrived. Several heads turned toward Hannah. She stood near the edge of the terrace, slightly apart from the main seating, and she felt the weight of the room reorient itself. She had felt this before, the specific gravity of a group of people deciding something about you while you're standing right there. It required a particular kind of stillness to survive it, without either collapsing or overreacting. She chose stillness. Victor continued. He was good at it, she would give him that. He mentioned the cancelled meeting, the missing folder, the music box. He framed each incident with just enough uncertainty to seem fair while landing each point with precision. He spoke about Hannah's access, her brief tenure, her outside visits during working hours. He never once said the word dishonest. He didn't need to. When he finished, the table was silent, and then Hannah spoke. "May I?" she said, quiet even, addressing no one specifically. Victor gestured with his glass in a way that meant by all means and conveyed this should be entertaining. Hannah reached into the folder she'd been holding since they arrived and placed 3 items on the table. The first was the scheduling system access log, showing the timestamp of the cancelled meeting, 11:42 on a Saturday morning, from a device that was not hers, while she was documented as having left the property at 9:17. The second was the inventory sheet from the study reorganization, dated and detailed, showing the music box logged in its original position with her note about its weight. The third was the journal. She didn't open it immediately. She set it on the table and let the room look at the initials on the cover. E.R. She watched the faces around the table carefully. Most showed confusion. 2 of the older relatives showed something else, a quick, involuntary tightening around the eyes that looked like recognition trying to hide itself. "Elena kept a record," Hannah said, "of the asset transfer, of why she made the decisions she made in the last months of her life, of what she was protecting, and who she was protecting it from." She looked at Victor steadily. "She names the people who were positioning themselves around the estate. She's specific about it. Names, relationships, intended outcomes." Victor's pleasant expression didn't collapse. It simply went very still, like a clock that has stopped mid-tick. "She also writes," Hannah continued, her voice dropping slightly, "about her son, about watching him go quiet, about running out of time to explain." She opened the journal to the second-to-last entry and set it in front of the nearest older relative, a woman in her 70s who had barely spoken all afternoon, but whose eyes had been doing the work of someone processing a great deal of complicated history. The woman read it. Her hand came up slowly and covered her mouth. "We knew," the woman said. The words came out like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. "Several of us knew what Elena was doing and why. We said nothing because—" She stopped, steadied herself. "Because it was easier to say nothing." "That is not," Victor began. "Victor!" The woman looked at him with the specific exhaustion of someone who has watched a person perform for years and is simply too tired to applaud anymore. "Sit down." He sat, and then Hannah heard it. Not a word, not a sound exactly. More like a shift in the atmosphere, the way a room changes when something that has been held rigid for a very long time finally releases. She turned. Damien was standing at the edge of the terrace, slightly apart from everyone, in the same way he always stood, contained, positioned, alone in a crowd. Except he wasn't contained anymore. His jaw was tight with the effort of something, and his eyes were bright in a way Hannah had never seen, and his hands, those perfectly still hands that gave nothing away, were pressed flat against the terrace railing, like he needed something solid to hold on to. He was not crying, but he was a man standing at the exact border of it, and everyone at the table could see it, and nobody spoke. Hannah looked at him and thought of Elena's words. He used to close his bedroom door when he was small and didn't want me to see him cry. The door, for the first time in years, was open. 1 month. It had seemed, on the morning Hannah arrived with her thin folder of credentials and her navy dress, and her complete ignorance of what she was walking into, like an impossible target. 23 assistants in 3 years, 11 days as the record. A house that had learned to brace itself for departure the way people brace for cold weather, not dramatically, just with a quiet, practiced resignation. She had lasted a month. More than that, she had changed the temperature of the place. The mansion felt different now in ways that were both visible and not. Marco hummed while he cooked, which Mr. Ellis said he hadn't done in 2 years. Sue had started teaching one of the younger groundskeepers the names of the plants along the east wall, passing knowledge forward the way people only do when they feel secure enough to invest in something continuing. The 2 bodyguards who had conducted their Cold War over a misplaced wristwatch now shared a table at lunch without either of them seeming to notice they'd stopped being adversaries. Small things. The kind of things that don't make it into reports or registers, but constitute, in their accumulation, the actual texture of a life. Victor had not returned to the mansion since the lakeside gathering. There had been no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no formal severance of anything. He had simply not come back, which was, Hannah reflected, entirely in keeping with his style. He had spent weeks creating problems without fingerprints. It made sense that he would also disappear without them. The older relatives had contacted Damien privately in the days following the gathering. Hannah didn't know the details of those conversations. She hadn't asked and hadn't been told, but she could read their effect in the incremental loosening of something around Damien's shoulders. A tension she had grown so accustomed to that she had almost stopped registering it as tension at all, until it began, slowly and unevenly, to ease. Miriam Voss had recovered. Hannah had called Aldenmore twice in the weeks following their visit, and the second call had been answered by Miriam herself, her voice sharp and slightly impatient in the way of someone who finds being fussed over more exhausting than whatever caused the fuss. She had asked one question before hanging up. Did he understand? Hannah had said yes. Miriam had said good and ended the call. On the morning of exactly 1 month since her arrival, Hannah was in the garden, not working, which was unusual enough that Sue had glanced at her twice to confirm it. She was simply sitting on the low stone bench near the lavender border, which had come into full bloom sometime in the last week and was currently conducting its own quiet riot of purple against the morning gray. She had her notebook with her, but hadn't opened it. Some mornings didn't require documentation. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly. Damien moved quietly enough that footsteps weren't always the first indication, but the particular quality of silence that preceded him changing slightly, the way a room adjusts when someone significant enters it. He sat down on the other end of the bench without preamble. This was new. 4 weeks ago, he would have remained standing, maintained the exact physical distance required by professional interaction, kept the exchange vertical and efficient. He sat down. They were quiet for a moment, which was comfortable in a way that Hannah recognized as something earned rather than given. "The garden looks better," Damien said finally.
"Sue has been taking care of his wrist," Hannah said. "He's working more evenly, better output, less strain."
A pause.
"You noticed his wrist in the first week?"
Day 3. Another pause, longer this time, filled with lavender and morning grey and the distant sound of Marco doing something energetic in the kitchen that involved what sounded like enthusiastic pan placement. "I've been thinking," Damien said, "about the first day." Hannah waited. "You gave an answer that 23 other people didn't give." He looked at the garden rather than at her, which he had come to understand was how he managed conversations that mattered to him, sidelong, with peripheral attention, like looking directly at the thing would make it disappear. "I've been trying to understand why." "I didn't think about it," Hannah said honestly. "You asked it like someone who genuinely needed to know, so I answered it like that." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Every other person heard a test," he said. "They answered what they thought I wanted." "I know." "You answered what was true." "I know that too." He turned and looked at her then, directly, which was rare enough that Hannah felt it like a change in light. His expression was not the closed door she had spent a month trying to read. It wasn't open exactly either. It was something more honest than both. The face of someone who has stopped performing composure and is simply present, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than most people realize. "I kept you," he said, "because your answer told me you understood something about loss that had nothing to do with logic." He paused. "My mother used to say that the most dangerous thing about grief is that it convinces you the feeling is the fact." I stopped trusting her judgment and told myself it was because her actions warranted it. Another pause, quieter. It wasn't. I was grieving something I thought I'd already lost, and I punished her for it while she was still alive. Hannah said nothing. Some things don't need a response. They need a witness. "The journal," he started. "She never stopped trusting you," Hannah said. "Not for a single day. She just ran out of time to say it clearly." Damien looked back at the garden. Something moved through his face, not dramatic, not collapsing, but real. The way weather moves through a landscape, changing it slightly and permanently. "I know that now," he said quietly. They sat for a while longer in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The lavender did its work. Marco's kitchen percussion continued distantly. Sue appeared at the far end of the garden, noticed them on the bench, and with the tact of a man who had learned to read atmospheres from watching Hannah, quietly changed direction. Eventually Damien said, "I'd like you to stay." "I planned to," Hannah said. "Not as my assistant." She looked at him. "The household needs someone who understands people better than they understand themselves." He said it with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed a thing enough times to finally say it simply. "The staff trust you. The operations run better, and I—" He stopped, considered. "I would like to keep talking to the one person who answers questions honestly." Hannah looked at the lavender border, at the garden that was growing better because someone had finally paid attention to it, at the house behind them that had shifted slowly and irreversibly from a place people endured to a place people inhabited. "All right," she said, not dramatically, not with the weight of conclusion, just simply, the way you agree to something that was already true before either of you said it out loud. Damien nodded once, and for the second time since Hannah's arrival, the second time in 4 years, he smiled. Not the brief, unguarded flash from the gala, gone before anyone could register it. This one stayed. Small, unpracticed, slightly uneven, like something that had been stored somewhere dark for too long and was relearning how light worked. Hannah didn't comment on it, but she noticed. She always noticed.